Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America. Places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Our journey takes us to the high desert of New Mexico, where the ancient monolith known as Shiprock rises nearly 1,600 feet above the surrounding landscape. For the Navajo people, this place is sacred. For the officers who patrol this territory, it is both home and something else entirely. Across these hills, mesas, and empty highways are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Navajo Tribal Police who serve this land operate under a set of unwritten rules. Guidelines passed down through generations of officers who have encountered things that defy explanation. These are not superstitions, but survival tactics, developed through experience with phenomena that patrol manuals never mention. In the shadow of Shiprock, the boundary between the natural world and the spiritual one grows thin. Officers here learn quickly that some calls require more than standard procedure. They learn that some nights, the greatest danger doesn't come from criminals or the elements, but from something older than both. The 7 rules we will explore tonight have kept officers alive when standard protocols would not suffice. Now, let us begin with our first rule. It was late November of 2013 when Officer Daniel Bigay received the call that would change everything. The dispatch came in at 10:47 p.m., a report of a stranded vehicle on Highway 491, approximately 15 miles south of Shiprock. The caller had been cut off mid-sentence, leaving only static and the faint sound of wind. Daniel was nearing the end of his shift, but protocol required response to all distress calls. His partner, Officer Thomas Yazzie, had already clocked out for the night, heading home to his family in Kirtland. Against his better judgment and the first rule that senior officers had impressed upon him, Daniel decided to respond alone rather than wake his partner. The desert night was cold as Daniel guided his patrol vehicle southbound. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath formed small clouds in the cruiser's cabin. The highway stretched before him like a black ribbon, illuminated only by his headlights and the vast canopy of stars above. To his west, the massive silhouette of Shiprock stood against the night sky, its jagged peaks seeming to tear at the fabric of the heavens. Daniel had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 3 years, transferred from the Albuquerque department after his marriage to a woman from the reservation. He respected the local customs, but had never fully embraced the spiritual beliefs that many of his colleagues held. That was about to change. As Daniel approached the reported location, his headlights swept across the empty highway. No vehicle was visible. He slowed to a crawl, scanning the roadside with his spotlight. Nothing. The dispatcher tried the caller's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. Daniel was about to call it in as a false report when his spotlight caught something. Tire tracks leading off the highway and into the desert, heading west toward Shiprock. Against procedure, Daniel decided to follow them, reasoning that the vehicle might have gone off the road and the driver was injured. The tracks were fresh, made within the last few hours. They led him across the desert floor, weaving between juniper and sagebrush. The cruiser's tires crunched over the rocky terrain, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Daniel kept one hand on his radio, the other on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. After half a mile, the tracks ended abruptly at the base of a small ridge. No vehicle, no driver, nothing. Daniel stepped out of his cruiser, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. The air had grown strangely still, the usual desert wind completely absent. In the distance, a coyote howled, but the sound was wrong. too high-pitched, too sustained. Daniel circled the area where the tracks ended, finding nothing out of place. No signs of a crash, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. As he turned back toward his vehicle, his flashlight beam caught something on the ground. A single child's shoe, small and pink, lying half buried in the sand. He bent to pick it up, but as his fingers touched the worn leather, a voice whispered directly behind him, "Don't." Daniel spun around, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there. The voice had been clear, close enough that he should have seen someone standing there. He radioed dispatch to report his location and request backup, but the radio emitted only static. That's when he noticed the temperature inside his cruiser had dropped dramatically. The windshield now covered in a thick layer of frost, despite the relatively mild desert air. The next thing Daniel remembered was the first light of dawn. He was sitting in his driver's seat, engine running, headlights aimed west toward Shiprock. The child's shoe was gone. His radio was working perfectly, and dispatch had been trying to reach him for hours. The cruiser was parked exactly where he had left it, but the tire tracks that had led him off the highway had vanished. The official report listed the incident as possible disorientation due to fatigue. But Daniel knew better. He had broken the first rule of patrolling this land: never respond to calls alone after dark. The senior officers who had warned him understood what Daniel now knew: that some things in this desert require the presence of another person, another witness, to keep you anchored to reality. Daniel never worked another night shift without a partner, and he never again responded to a call alone after darkness fell across the high desert. In the spring of 2015, Officer Maria Nez received a call about trespassers at the base of Shiprock. The night had been uncharacteristically quiet for a Tuesday, with only minor traffic violations and a domestic disturbance that had resolved itself before her arrival. Mariah was completing paperwork at the Shiprock District Substation when the call came through at 3:17 a.m. The dispatcher's voice was measured, but Maria could detect the underlying uncertainty as she relayed the details. The caller, an elderly Navajo woman identified as Mrs. Charlie, reported seeing non-tribal members climbing the sacred formation, which had been closed to climbers since 1970. What made the call unusual was not just the time, but the caller's insistence that the trespassers were not of this world, a phrase she had repeated 3 times during the brief conversation. Maria, a 12-year veteran of the force, had heard such claims before and usually dismissed them as mischief or misunderstanding. The reservation had its share of strange occurrences, most of which could be explained by natural phenomena or human activity. But something in Mrs. Charlie's voice, a mixture of fear and certainty that transcended the usual late-night confusion, made her take the call seriously. Maria had known Mrs. Charlie for years, a respected elder who rarely called authorities unless absolutely necessary. Her partner that night was Officer Ben Talchief, a younger officer who had grown up on the reservation but had been away for college before returning to join the force. Ben was competent and dedicated, but his years away had left him somewhat disconnected from the traditional beliefs that still held sway in many parts of the reservation. The drive to Shiprock took them through empty highways that seemed to absorb their headlights rather than reflect them. The pavement stretched before them like a black river, the cruiser's headlights creating a small bubble of light in the overwhelming darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows across the desert floor that seemed to move with unnatural independence. As they approached the formation, Maria noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the night were absent. No coyotes, no insects, no wind. The silence was absolute, pressing in on them from all directions, so complete that it seemed to have a physical presence. a weight that settled in their chests and made conversation feel intrusive. Ben seemed to feel it too, adjusting his rearview mirror as if expecting to see something behind them. "Quiet tonight," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the cruiser's cabin. Maria nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Too quiet," she replied, the words barely audible. Maria had been taught the second rule by her grandfather, a medicine man who had served as a tribal police officer in the 1970s. Always acknowledge the spirits when entering sacred areas. She made a practice of this whenever she approached Shiprock, speaking quietly in Navajo, asking permission to enter and promising respect. Ben, more modern in his outlook, often teased her about these superstitions. But he remained quiet tonight, his own discomfort apparent in the way he kept checking the mirrors and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. As they reached the designated parking area, they found no vehicles, no climbers, no sign of anyone having been there recently. The ground was undisturbed, covered with a layer of fine desert sand that showed no footprints, no tire tracks, no evidence of human presence at all. Maria radioed dispatch to report their arrival and status, her voice echoing strangely in the cruiser's cabin, the words seeming to hang in the air rather than dissipate as they normally would. As she spoke, Ben pointed toward the formation. "Look," he whispered, his finger trembling slightly. Maria followed his gaze and saw it, a faint light moving slowly up the side of Shiprock, far too high to be a climber with a headlamp. The light was pale blue, pulsing gently as it ascended the vertical face of the monolith. Maria grabbed her binoculars from the glove compartment. But even magnified, she could make out no source for the light, no person carrying it. It moved with impossible grace, sometimes seeming to pass directly through solid rock, other times pausing at locations where no human could possibly maintain a hold. The light danced across the rock face, leaving faint trails that lingered for a moment before fading into the darkness. Ben wanted to approach the formation on foot, but Maria held him back. "Wait," she said, her hand on his arm. "There's something not right about this." Instead, she stepped out of the vehicle and stood facing Shiprock, speaking in quiet Navajo. "Ya'ate Shidinee," she began, greeting the people of the rock and explaining their purpose as protectors of the sacred place. She spoke of her grandfather, of his service to both the tribe and the land, of her own commitment to maintaining the balance between the worlds. As she spoke, the blue light paused its ascent, then began to descend, moving with the same impossible fluidity. Ben watched from the cruiser, his skepticism replaced by something like awe, a recognition that there were forces at work beyond his understanding. When Maria finished her acknowledgement, the light vanished completely, as if it had never been there. The sudden return to darkness was jarring, leaving spots in Maria's vision where the blue light had been. She stood for a moment longer, her eyes closed, listening to the silence that had once again settled over the desert. When she opened her eyes, Ben was standing beside her, his expression one of confusion and wonder. "What was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but it's gone now." The officers spent the next hour searching the area with flashlights, finding nothing out of place. The ground remained undisturbed, the vegetation untouched, the rocks unmoved. They checked the perimeter of the parking area, the trailheads, the surrounding desert. Nothing. The original caller, Mrs. Charlie, could not be reached for follow-up, her phone going straight to voicemail. As they prepared to leave, Ben asked Maria what she had said to the formation. "I introduced us properly," she explained. "I told them we meant no harm, that we were there to protect the land." I asked for their understanding and their permission to be there." Ben nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The drive back to the substation was quieter than the drive out. Both officers lost in their own thoughts. The silence of the desert had returned to its normal state, with the usual sounds of the night gradually reasserting themselves. A distant coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the gentle whisper of wind across the sand. But something had changed, at least for Ben. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by a cautious respect, an acknowledgement that there were phenomena in this land that defied conventional explanation. The incident report listed unexplained light phenomena and possible false report. But both officers knew they had witnessed something beyond explanation. Maria had followed the second rule, acknowledging the spirits of the sacred place, and perhaps that acknowledgement had prevented something more serious from occurring. Ben never again questioned the traditional practices that many officers quietly observed, understanding that in this land, respect was more than courtesy. It was protection. In the weeks that followed, Maria and Ben occasionally spoke of that night. Never in detail, never in official contexts, but as a shared experience that had changed them both. Ben began to learn more about the traditional beliefs of his people, asking Maria questions about her grandfather, about the ceremonies and practices that had sustained the Navajo for generations. Maria, for her part, found herself paying closer attention to the subtle signs and signals that the land offered, the small indications that something beyond the ordinary was at work. The incident at Shiprock remained unexplained, filed away in the archives of the Navajo Tribal Police as just another of the many mysteries that dotted the landscape of the reservation. But for Maria and Ben, it was a reminder that some places operated under different rules, that some boundaries existed not on maps, but in the collective memory of a people who had understood long before modern science that the world was more complex, more mysterious than it appeared. The second rule, always acknowledge the spirits when entering sacred areas, was not just a superstition, but a practical guideline for navigating a landscape where the veil between worlds was thin, where respect and acknowledgement could mean the difference between safety and danger, understanding and confusion, life and something else entirely. As the years passed, Maria would think of that night whenever she approached Shiprock, whenever she spoke the words of acknowledgement that her grandfather had taught her. She would wonder about the blue light, about Mrs. Charlie's call, about the things that existed just beyond the edge of human perception. But she never sought answers, never tried to explain what couldn't be explained. Instead, she maintained the practice of acknowledgement, of respect, of recognition that some places, sometimes, some phenomena required not investigation, but reverence, not analysis, but acceptance. In this way, she honored both her grandfather's legacy and the land itself, maintaining the delicate balance that had sustained her people for generations in the shadow of Shiprock, where the boundary between worlds was thin, and the rules that governed passage across that boundary were as real and as necessary as any law written in books. It was a sweltering July day in 2016 when Officer Samuel Sosi was called to a remote homestead 20 miles northeast of Shiprock. An elderly woman had reported a break-in, though nothing appeared to have been stolen. Samuel arrived to find the woman, Mrs. Charlie, sitting on her porch, visibly shaken. The back door of her small house had been forced open, but the interior showed no signs of theft or vandalism. In fact, the only thing out of place was a small clay pot, usually kept on a shelf in the living room, now sitting in the center of the kitchen table. Samuel, who had grown up in the area, recognized the pot as traditional Navajo pottery, decorated with symbols of protection. As Samuel began his investigation, Mrs. Charlie explained that she had been away visiting her sister in Farmington for 2 days. When she returned that morning, she found the door forced and the house in this strange condition. What bothered her most was not the break-in itself, but the feeling that something had been left behind rather than taken. Samuel photographed the scene, collected fingerprints, and made note of the pot's unusual placement. As he prepared to leave, Mrs. Charlie asked him to take the pot with him for evidence. Samuel hesitated. The third rule, passed down from older officers, was never to take anything from a crime scene that might be spiritually significant. But procedure was procedure, and the pot might hold fingerprints or other evidence. Against his better judgment, Samuel placed the pot in an evidence bag and took it with him. Back at the station in Shiprock, Samuel logged the evidence and stored the pot in the evidence room. The rest of his shift passed uneventfully, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, Samuel dreamed of the pot, of it sitting on a shelf in a dark room, of voices speaking in ancient Navajo, of shadows moving just beyond his field of vision. He woke repeatedly, each time finding his bedroom window open, though he was certain he had closed it before going to sleep. The morning light brought no relief. If anything, the feeling of being watched intensified. The following day, Samuel's partner, Officer Rachel Atakai, noticed his unease. "You look like you've seen a skinwalker," she joked, but her smile faded when she saw his expression. Samuel explained about the pot, about the dreams, about the open window. Rachel listened carefully, then asked if he had performed any kind of acknowledgement before taking the pot from Mrs. Charlie's home. Samuel admitted he had not. He had treated it like any other piece of evidence. Rachel's expression grew serious. "You need to take it back," she said. "Now, before the sun sets." Samuel initially resisted, citing proper procedure, but Rachel was insistent. She explained that the third rule existed for a reason, that certain objects carried spiritual significance that transcended their physical form. "You didn't just take a pot, Sam," she said. "You took something that was placed there as a boundary, as a warning. By removing it, you've invited whatever it was keeping out." Reluctantly, Samuel retrieved the pot from evidence and drove back to Mrs. Charlie's homestead. When he arrived, he found the woman sitting on her porch exactly as he had left her 2 days before. She seemed unsurprised to see him, merely pointing to the kitchen table where the pot had originally been found. As Samuel placed the pot back on the table, he felt an immediate sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Mrs. Charlie thanked him without asking why he had returned it. That night, Samuel slept peacefully for the first time since taking the pot. The break-in was never solved, and the official report noted only unidentified fingerprints and no item stolen. But Samuel learned the importance of the third rule, that some things found at crime scenes are not evidence, but warnings, boundaries placed by those who understand the spiritual landscape of this land. Taking such objects doesn't just compromise an investigation. It compromises the very fabric that separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. Officer Lucy Thompson had transferred to the Navajo Tribal Police from Phoenix 6 months before the winter solstice of 2017. She was still adjusting to the vast emptiness of the reservation, the way distances seemed to stretch and contract depending on the light, the way silence could feel heavier than sound. Her supervisor, Officer Henry Lee, had tried to explain the unwritten rules that governed their work here, but Lucy, trained in urban policing, found them difficult to accept. The fourth rule, avoid the mesa during certain times of the year, seemed particularly arbitrary. "Which times?" she had asked. "When you know," Henry had replied, which only frustrated her further. The call came in on December 20th. 2 days before the winter solstice. A group of hikers, non-tribal members from Colorado, had failed to return from a day hike around the base of Shiprock. Their vehicle was found at the trailhead, but there was no sign of the hikers themselves. As the most recent addition to the force, Lucy was assigned to conduct a preliminary search, while more experienced officers organized a proper search party. Henry tried to dissuade her, suggesting they wait until morning, but Lucy was determined to prove herself. "It's just a mesa," she said. "I'll be fine. I'll stick to the base, do a quick sweep, and report back." The winter sun was already setting as Lucy began her search, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Lucy regretted not bringing a heavier jacket. She followed the trail clockwise around the base of Shiprock, calling out the hikers' names at regular intervals. The only response was the echo of her own voice, sounding strangely alien in the vast emptiness. After 40 minutes, Lucy found the first sign of the hikers. A backpack lying beside the trail, its contents scattered as if dropped in haste. Lucy radioed her discovery to Henry, who reminded her again that time was running short. "The light's going, Lucy. Head back now. We'll start fresh at dawn." Lucy agreed, but decided to continue just a little farther, following what appeared to be footprints leading away from the trail. The prints were clear at first, but became increasingly erratic, sometimes spaced far apart as if their maker had been running, other times dragging as if exhausted. The terrain grew rougher as Lucy moved around the western face of the formation, the path narrowing between sheer rock walls. The last light of day caught something ahead, a flash of color against the reddish-brown rock. Lucy moved toward it, her flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness. It was a jacket, one she recognized from the hiker's vehicle description, hanging from a rock formation like a flag of surrender. As Lucy reached for the jacket, she felt a sudden drop in temperature. The wind, which had been calm, began to swirl around her, making a sound like whispering in a language she couldn't understand. The flashlight beam flickered, then died, leaving her in near total darkness. That's when Lucy realized her mistake. It was the winter solstice, one of the times Henry had meant when he said she would know. The Navajo believed this was a time when the veil between worlds grew thin, when certain places became dangerous to those who didn't understand how to navigate them. Lucy was alone on the mesa during a time when even experienced Navajo avoided it. The next hour passed in a blur of disorientation and fear. Lucy tried to retrace her steps, but the landscape seemed to shift around her, familiar landmarks becoming unrecognizable. The whispering wind grew louder, forming words she almost understood before they dissolved into meaningless sound. At one point, she saw figures moving in the darkness, tall, silent shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. They never came close enough to see clearly, but their presence was undeniable. Lucy found herself speaking aloud, promising to respect the land, to follow the rules, to leave immediately if only she could find her way back. As if in response, a faint light appeared in the distance. The headlights of Henry's vehicle, coming to find her despite the darkness and the danger. The hikers were found the next morning, huddled together in a small cave 3 miles from where Lucy had discovered their belongings. They were dehydrated and disoriented, but unharmed, with no memory of how they had gotten there or why they had abandoned their gear. The official report cited unexpected weather changes and disorientation due to unfamiliar terrain. But Lucy knew better. She had experienced something that couldn't be explained by meteorology or psychology. She had learned the 4th rule not as an arbitrary restriction, but as a survival strategy, developed over generations of experience with the mesa during times when the boundary between worlds grew thin. Lucy never again questioned the seasonal warnings of her Navajo colleagues, understanding that some places operate on a different calendar than the one printed in her patrol car. Officer Michael Roanhorse had grown up hearing stories about the lights that sometimes appeared around Shiprock. His grandmother called them spirit fires and warned him never to approach them or look directly at them. As a teenager, Michael had dismissed these stories as superstitions, but as a Navajo Tribal Police officer, he had learned to respect the traditional knowledge that had kept his people safe for generations. The fifth rule, never look directly at unusual lights, was one he took seriously. Having heard too many accounts from colleagues who had ignored it and suffered consequences that defied medical explanation. It was September 2018 when Michael and his partner, Officer Susan Yazzie, received a call about strange lights near the old uranium mines south of Shiprock. The caller, a rancher, reported seeing multiple orbs of light moving in patterns that didn't match any aircraft he was familiar with. Michael and Susan were finishing their shift and decided to investigate before heading home. As they approached the area, Michael could see the lights himself. 3 pale blue orbs moving in a triangular formation, then separating and coming together again. Susan wanted to get closer for a better look, but Michael reminded her of the fifth rule. "We'll observe from here," he said, parking the cruiser on a ridge overlooking the mines. The lights continued their strange dance, sometimes hovering motionless, other times moving with impossible speed and precision. Susan, who had grown up off the reservation, was fascinated. "What do you think they are?" she asked, reaching for her binoculars. Michael stopped her. "Don't look directly at them," he warned. "Use the side mirror." Susan gave him a skeptical look, but complied, angling the side mirror to watch the light's reflection. As they watched, the lights began to move toward their position, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Michael started the engine, ready to leave if necessary, but Susan was mesmerized by the display. That's when Michael noticed something strange. The area around the lights seemed to be distorted, as if viewed through heat waves or water. The desert floor appeared to ripple and shift, though the night was cool and still. The lights were now close enough that Michael could feel a low, thrumming vibration through the cruiser's frame. Susan, despite Michael's warning, had lowered her window and was watching the lights directly. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Michael reached over to pull her back inside, but it was too late. The next thing Michael remembered was the first light of dawn. He was sitting in the driver's seat of the cruiser, which was parked on the shoulder of Highway 491, 15 miles from where they had stopped to watch the lights. Susan was in the passenger seat, her eyes open but unfocused. When Michael spoke to her, she didn't respond. He drove her to the hospital in Shiprock, where doctors found nothing medically wrong with her, though she remained in a trance-like state. 3 days later, Susan woke up with no memory of the incident or the days that followed. The only lingering effect was an extreme sensitivity to light, requiring her to wear sunglasses even indoors. The official report listed possible exposure to unknown atmospheric phenomena and recommended further study. But Michael knew what had happened. Susan had looked directly at the lights, breaking the fifth rule. He had seen similar cases before, though never this severe. Some officers experienced temporary blindness, others developed strange phobias or recurring nightmares. A few, like Susan, lost time and memory. Michael never learned what the lights truly were, but he understood their power and the importance of the fifth rule. The lights around Shiprock were not to be observed directly, not out of superstition, but because they operated on principles that human physiology and perception were not equipped to handle without consequences that science had yet to explain. Officer David Sinigini had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 15 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. He carried more than the standard issue equipment in his patrol vehicle. Tucked into a small leather pouch on his visor was a bundle of cedar and sage, wrapped in cloth and tied with a feather. His grandmother had given it to him when he first joined the force, explaining that traditional protection was as important as his bulletproof vest. The sixth rule, always carry traditional protection, was one David observed without question. Having seen too many colleagues fall victim to phenomena that modern equipment couldn't defend against. It was March 2019 when David and his partner, Officer Rebecca Wilson, were called to a domestic disturbance in a remote area northwest of Shiprock. The caller, a young woman, was hysterical, speaking about her husband's strange behavior and mentioning something about the owl woman visiting their home. David recognized the reference immediately. The owl woman, or Naashjai Astzan, was a figure from Navajo mythology associated with witchcraft and misfortune. Rebecca, who had transferred from a department in Utah, had never heard of such entities and dismissed the caller's concerns as delusion. As they approached the small house, David noticed that the usual desert sounds were absent. No birds, no insects, no wind. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Rebecca went to the front door while David circled the property, his hand instinctively touching the leather pouch on his visor. The back door stood open, swinging slightly despite the lack of wind. David drew his weapon and entered cautiously, his training taking over even as his instincts screamed that this was not a normal domestic call. The house was in disarray, furniture overturned, dishes broken on the floor. In the bedroom, David found the husband sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The man turned as David entered, and David recoiled at the sight of his eyes. They were completely black. No whites visible, no reflection of light. "She's been here," the man said, his voice a dry whisper. "The owl woman. She marked me." David felt a cold dread spread through his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of corn pollen, sprinkling it on the threshold and speaking quietly in Navajo, calling on protection and blessing. As he did, the man screamed, covering his eyes as if struck by a bright light. Rebecca rushed in at the sound, her weapon drawn, but stopped short at the sight of the scene. The next hours passed in a blur of strange phenomena. The lights in the house flickered and died, replaced by an eerie blue glow that seemed to emanate from the walls. The temperature dropped dramatically, frost forming on the windows despite the mild spring evening outside. At one point, Rebecca swore she saw a large owl perched on the roof outside the bedroom window, though when David looked, there was nothing there. The husband became increasingly agitated, speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. Ancient words that David recognized but couldn't place. Throughout it all, David kept his hand on his traditional protection, the cedar and sage serving as a barrier between the ordinary and the extraordinary. By dawn, the phenomena had subsided. The husband was unconscious but breathing normally. His eyes returned to their usual color. Rebecca was shaken but unharmed, though she kept glancing at the windows as if expecting to see something looking back at her. The official report cited meth-induced psychosis and domestic violence. But David knew better. He had encountered something that couldn't be explained by drugs or mental illness, something that responded only to traditional protection. Rebecca never questioned David's practices again, asking him to provide her with her own bundle of cedar and sage before her next shift. The sixth rule, always carry traditional protection, had proven its worth once more. defending against a threat that modern policing methods couldn't even acknowledge, let alone address. Officer Emily Charlie had served with the Navajo Tribal Police for 8 years, following a career in the military that had taken her far from her ancestral home. Born and raised in the small community of Sheep Springs, Emily had left the reservation at 18, joining the Army with dreams of seeing the world beyond the red mesas and dusty roads of her youth. Her military service had taken her to Afghanistan and Germany, exposing her to different cultures and ways of understanding the world. But it was the return to her homeland that had proven most challenging, forcing her to reconcile the modern, rational worldview she had adopted with the traditional beliefs she had grown up with. Emily understood the rules that governed her work in this land, rules that had been passed down through generations of Navajo law enforcement officers who had learned to navigate the thin boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. But the 7th rule, never speak of what you've seen to outsiders, was the one she found most difficult. Emily believed in transparency, in sharing knowledge that might help others understand the complexities of law enforcement on the reservation. Her military training had emphasized documentation, communication, and the free exchange of information as cornerstones of effective operation. But her experiences on the reservation had taught her that some knowledge was dangerous, that speaking of certain phenomena to those outside the culture could invite consequences that extended beyond the individual officer. The tension between these two approaches to knowledge had been a constant undercurrent in Emily's work. She had seen things that defied conventional explanation. Lights that moved against the wind, voices that spoke from empty spaces, footprints that appeared and disappeared without logical cause. Each incident had tested her ability to balance the requirements of modern law enforcement with the traditional wisdom that her grandmother had imparted to her as a child. Some things are not meant to be shared with those who don't have the context to understand them, her grandmother had told her repeatedly. Knowledge without wisdom is a dangerous thing. It was June 2020 when Emily responded to a call that would test her commitment to the 7th rule in ways she hadn't anticipated. The call came in at 2:43 a.m. on a Tuesday night, dispatching her to a convenience store on the edge of Shiprock. The caller, the store's night clerk, reported hearing whispers in a language he didn't recognize, though the store was empty except for him. When Emily arrived, she found the clerk sitting outside on the curb, his arms wrapped around his knees, refusing to re-enter the building. The night was unusually still, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on them with an almost physical weight. "They're still in there," the clerk said, his voice trembling as he pointed toward the glass doors of the store. "Talking about the old ways, about things that should stay buried." Emily could see the fear in his eyes, a primal terror that went beyond simple nervousness. She had known this clerk for years, a reliable man who had never before reported anything unusual. Something had genuinely shaken him, something that went beyond ordinary explanation. Emily entered cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the store. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss, revealing an interior that appeared normal at first glance. Shelves stocked with merchandise, register closed and locked, no signs of break-in or vandalism. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow that made the shadows seem deeper by contrast. But as she moved toward the back of the store, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the quiet space, she heard it. Faint whispers, speaking in ancient Navajo, discussing ceremonies that had been banned for generations. Emily recognized the voices, though she couldn't identify their source. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls and merchandise, the sound seeming to bend around corners and pass through solid objects. The words were clear, yet distorted, as if filtered through water or time. They spoke of ceremonies that had been forbidden for over a century, of practices that had been buried with the ancestors who had performed them. Emily felt a cold dread spread through her chest, recognizing the signs of a spiritual disturbance that had nothing to do with human intruders. Emily spoke quietly in Navajo, acknowledging the presence and asking it to leave, explaining that this was a place of business, not a place for ancient ceremonies. Her voice sounded small in the vast space of the store, almost swallowed by the oppressive silence that had fallen between the whispers. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, speaking of things Emily had only heard in hushed tones from her grandmother. Practices that had been abandoned because they were too dangerous, too powerful, too likely to disturb the delicate balance between worlds. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pouch of protection containing corn pollen, cedar, and a small piece of turquoise that had been blessed by a medicine man. Holding it in her hand, she continued to speak, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The fluorescent lights began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move with unnatural independence. The whispers grew more agitated, their tones shifting from discussion to accusation, from remembrance to warning. The disturbance lasted for nearly an hour before the whispers finally faded, leaving Emily alone in the silent store. The temperature gradually returned to normal, the lights stabilized, and the oppressive feeling lifted. She found nothing out of place, no evidence that anyone had been there besides herself and the frightened clerk. The official report cited possible auditory hallucination and stress-related incident. But Emily knew better. She had encountered something ancient and powerful, something that responded only to traditional methods of address and protection. The incident left her shaken, but determined to understand what had happened. In the days that followed, Emily found herself thinking more and more about the seventh rule. Her grandmother had explained it to her when she had first decided to join the tribal police. "Some knowledge is like fire," she had said. "It can warm and illuminate, or it can burn and destroy. The difference is in how it's used and who is using it. Outsiders don't have the context, the lifetime of cultural understanding that gives knowledge its proper shape and meaning. When you share these things without that context, you're not really sharing knowledge at all. You're just releasing something dangerous into the world." Emily had struggled with this explanation, seeing it as unnecessarily secretive, perhaps even counterproductive to the work of law enforcement. But the convenience store incident had made her reconsider. There was something different about the phenomena she encountered on the reservation, something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of modern understanding. These weren't just ghost stories or local legends. They were experiences that challenged the very foundations of her worldview. Experiences that seemed to respond differently to different approaches. 2 weeks later, Emily was contacted by a researcher from a university in Arizona who had heard rumors of strange phenomena on the reservation. Dr. Robert Mitchell was a professor of anthropology specializing in indigenous cultures and their interactions with modern law enforcement. He introduced himself as someone interested in understanding the unique challenges faced by tribal police officers, particularly those related to cultural phenomena that might be misunderstood or overlooked by conventional approaches. "I've heard some interesting stories about the Navajo Tribal Police," he said during their initial phone conversation. "Stories about encounters that don't fit into standard police reports. I'm conducting a study on cultural-specific law enforcement challenges, and I think your perspective could be incredibly valuable." Emily hesitated, remembering the seventh rule, but her desire to bridge the gap between traditional knowledge and modern understanding won out. Part of her still believed that with the right approach, with proper documentation and analysis, these phenomena could be understood in a way that would benefit everyone. She agreed to an interview, carefully avoiding specific details, but describing the general nature of some of the unusual calls she had responded to during her years on the force. She spoke of unexplained lights, of voices in empty places, of disturbances that seemed to respond more to traditional methods than to conventional law enforcement techniques. Dr. Mitchell was enthusiastic, asking probing questions that Emily answered as honestly as she could, while still maintaining some boundaries. "This is exactly the kind of information that's been missing from the literature," he said. "The academic community has so little understanding of these experiences, and that lack of understanding leads to misunderstandings and ineffective policies." The consequences were immediate and unsettling. That night, Emily heard the whispers again, this time in her own home. She was preparing for bed when she noticed the temperature drop, the air growing suddenly cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The whispers began faintly at first, then grew louder, speaking of betrayal, of broken trust, of knowledge shared with those who couldn't understand or respect it. They were the same voices from the convenience store, but now they seemed more personal, more accusatory. Emily tried her usual methods of protection, speaking in Navajo, holding her pouch of sacred herbs, but the whispers only grew more insistent. The phenomena escalated over the following days. Objects moving on their own, lights flickering, the temperature dropping dramatically in isolated areas of her house. Doors would open and close on their own. Electronic devices would turn on and off without explanation. And she would sometimes see shadowy figures moving just at the edge of her vision. These weren't just random occurrences. They seemed targeted, deliberate, as if something was trying to send a message. Emily tried everything she knew to address the disturbance, consulting with elders and medicine men, performing cleansing ceremonies, strengthening her spiritual protections. But nothing worked until she contacted Dr. Mitchell and asked him to destroy his notes and abandon his study. At first, he resisted, explaining that the information was too valuable to his research. This could help people understand, he argued. It could bridge the gap between traditional knowledge and modern science. Emily explained that the gap couldn't be bridged by extracting knowledge from its cultural context, that some things weren't meant to be analyzed and categorized, but to be respected and understood within the framework that had given them meaning. "You're not preserving knowledge by documenting it," she told him. "You're killing it, removing the very elements that make it what it is. This knowledge isn't just information, it's alive, and it has rules that must be followed." Reluctantly, Dr. Mitchell agreed to destroy his notes and abandon his study. As soon as he confirmed that he had done so, the phenomena in Emily's house ceased. The temperature returned to normal, the whispers faded away, and the objects stopped moving on their own. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, leaving Emily exhausted but certain of something she had suspected, but never fully understood until now. Emily learned the hard way why the seventh rule existed, not to keep knowledge secret, but to protect both the knowledge and those who might seek it without proper understanding or respect. Some things couldn't be separated from their cultural context, couldn't be analyzed or explained using frameworks that didn't account for the spiritual dimensions of reality. The traditional knowledge of the Navajo people wasn't just a collection of beliefs or practices. It was a living system, interconnected and self-reinforcing, with its own internal logic and its own methods of verification. Emily never again spoke of her experiences to outsiders, understanding that some knowledge was meant to be held within the culture that had developed it over generations of experience with phenomena that defied conventional explanation. The seventh rule wasn't about secrecy. It was about preservation, protection, and the recognition that not all knowledge was meant to be shared beyond the boundaries of those who understood its power and its proper use. In the years that followed, Emily became more committed to traditional practices, spending more time with elders and medicine men, deepening her understanding of the spiritual dimensions of her work. She found that this deeper understanding didn't conflict with her law enforcement duties, but enhanced them, giving her tools and approaches that weren't available in conventional police training. She learned to navigate the boundary between worlds with greater skill and confidence, not by denying the reality of either world, but by respecting the integrity of both. The convenience store incident became a reference point in her mind, a reminder of what happened when the boundaries were crossed without proper preparation or understanding. She thought of it often when training new officers, particularly those who, like her, had spent time away from the reservation and returned with different perspectives. The rules aren't restrictions, she would tell them. They're protections. They're not about keeping secrets from outsiders. They're about preserving something sacred, something that can be dangerous when removed from its proper context. Emily continued to believe in transparency and communication, but she came to understand that true transparency required acknowledging the limits of what could be shared, what could be understood across cultural boundaries. Some knowledge required not just intellectual understanding, but embodied experience, not just theoretical frameworks, but lived practice. The seventh rule, she realized, was not about withholding information, but about recognizing the different kinds of knowledge and the different ways of knowing that existed in the world. As she patrolled the reservation, responding to calls and maintaining the peace, Emily carried this understanding with her. She became a bridge between worlds, not by translating one into the terms of the other, but by respecting the integrity of both and helping others do the same. The seventh rule, once a source of conflict for her, had become a source of strength. A reminder that some things were meant to be protected rather than exposed, preserved rather than analyzed. In this understanding, Emily found not limitation, but freedom, not secrecy, but wisdom, not isolation, but a deeper connection to the land, the people, and the complex reality that existed in the space between the visible and invisible worlds. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, particularly in places like the high desert of New Mexico, where the boundary between the natural and spiritual worlds grows thin. The Navajo Tribal Police, who serve this territory, navigate a complex landscape, one that requires more than standard training and procedure. The 7 rules that keep them alive represent generations of accumulated wisdom, developed through direct experience with phenomena that defy conventional explanation. What we have explored tonight are not merely ghost stories or local legends. They are documented accounts from law enforcement officers trained to observe, report, and remain objective in the face of inexplicable events. These officers have learned that some calls require more than standard response protocols, that some territories operate under different laws than those written in statute books. Their experiences remind us that the American landscape contains mysteries that modern science has yet to explain, phenomena that persist despite our attempts to categorize and dismiss them. The silence that follows these stories is perhaps more telling than the stories themselves. It represents the gap between what we can prove and what we know to be true, between the measurable world and the one that operates just beyond our perception. In places like Shiprock, this gap narrows, allowing glimpses of a reality that coexists with our own, following different rules, responding to different authorities. The Navajo Tribal Police who serve this land understand this reality, not through theory, but through direct experience, developing rules that keep them safe as they move between worlds. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Our understanding of these phenomena grows with each account, each verification, each careful documentation of events that defy conventional explanation. The Sleepless Campfire continues to collect and verify these accounts, preserving them not as entertainment, but as evidence of a world more complex and mysterious than we often acknowledge. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.